In February of 1993, a religious compound near Waco first captured the attention of law enforcement. The religion was branded a cult. The leader stood his ground. A standoff ensued. That brought media attention. Then the world was watching, as on April of that same year, the group, led by David Koresh, met their fiery end. While those people in the compound that day may have died, the Branch Davidians live on. Their story is still being told. The land where the compound once stood still bears reminders of what once stood at Mount Carmel. Branch Davidians call this site home, and today we're going to find it.
Texas is full of lost history, from lost cemeteries to abandoned buildings, from the infamous to the obscure. Hitch a ride and travel across the Lone Star State, looking for hints of Texas' colorful past, our lost history. This is Expedition Texas, and we're gonna find it.
The story of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians captured the attention of the world in 1993. The story has been told time and time again. For our story, though, we went to Mount Carmel, to the site of the compound, not just to see what remains, but to talk to the man who currently leads the Branch Davidians, Charles Pace. Charles has been a member since the mid-1970s, and he's hoping to finally set the record straight as it pertains to the Branch Davidians and David Koresh.
Well, when David Koresh came, he changed our Judeo-Christian beliefs and basically put himself in as the center of the belief system, that he was the Lamb of God, of Revelation 5 and 6. Now, Ellen G. White, who was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, prophesied in 1904 that someone was going to come within the Advent movement, the Seventh-day Adventist movement, and was going to declare that he had the mind of God, he sat in the seat of God, and that he was God. In 1984, I brought forth that prophecy in a 3.5-hour study that I gave to David Koresh and his followers, basically, and others that came here to see. Lois Roden called us all in to come and listen to whatever the Spirit was going to reveal at that time, but to mainly decide whether David Koresh was a true prophet or not. So I got to get up and give a 3.5-hour study, and I showed that he was the individual that Ellen White was prophesying that would come and claim to have the mind of God, claim to sit in the seat of God, and claim to be God. And I asked him point blank, I said, "Are you this man?" He said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Well, if you're this man, you understand that the Lord says to that individual, because you have said these things, I, the Lord, am going to send the strangers, the terrible of the nations," which is the U.S. Army, but even more so the Delta Force, the elite commando group within the Army, and they'll bring you down with a sword. We'll see how much of a god you are in the hands of those that slay you. You're not a god, you're just a man. And I said, you understand the punishment or the judgment that's going to befall you. It's the slaughter of men, women, and children, and a fire that destroys your whole complex. And he said, yes, I know that that's the prophecy and the outcome.
At some point while he was here, you decided to leave. Why?
Well, it was because I didn't believe in his teachings and who he was. And he didn't want anyone around here that didn't believe in him wholeheartedly. And you could see why, because the people that did believe in him died with him. And he knew that that was going to happen. It wasn't just he that was going to die, it was going to be others that follow him unto death.
Did you have contact with anyone on the inside during the raid?
Yes, I got a letter from Clive Doyle on February the 27th, the day before the raid, and I had sent them all a written transcript of my study in 1984. I sent it to them in a book. It was called The Revelation of Jesus Christ and His Righteousness. And I told them to give it to David Koresh. And Clive Doyle, basically wrote me back and he said, what you sent is basically the study you gave in 1984. He said, we'd like you to come and study with us to Mount Carmel. And that was the letter. I showed that to the FBI, and I asked them, can I go there and try to diffuse the situation and help them come out? They wouldn't let me. I asked them 7 different times, and I never got my letter back, by the way.
But Charles did come back, and coming up next, he tells us what remains of the Branch Davidian compound in Mount Carmel.
That's all I could preserve. The rest was basically buried.
We are near Waco, Texas, at Mount Carmel, the location of the infamous standoff and subsequent siege at the Branch Davidian compound. Our guide is one of only a few Branch Davidians left in the world, and one of the only Davidians still on the property. Charles Pace left the compound prior to the siege, but returned afterward to keep the memories alive and to maintain the property. He tells us what remains there at Mount Carmel.
Well, prior to the raid, we had a church and 13 houses. There's nothing here. The only thing that remains that was here back then is the dairy barn that I converted into a chapel when I first came on the property in 95, 96.
Tell us about these photos along the wall starting back here. Who are these figures?
These photos are, and the description of what message they brought underneath them, are the founders within the Advent movement, our church. The first one would be William Miller. The second one is Ellen G. White, the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She prophesied that Koresh would come, basically. And then we have Jones and Wagner, who brought a message in 1888 about the righteousness of Christ. And then we have Victor Houteff, who began the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist movement here in Waco back in 1930. And then we have Ben Roden, who established the Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventist in 1955. And Lois Roden, his wife, who took over after he died in 1978, and she established the Living Waters Branch. And then we have David Koresh, who I believe was raised of God to fulfill the prophecy within the Advent movement that Ellen White brought. And he has a right to be on that wall just as much as anyone else.
Outside of the chapel, it was time to meet Charles' wife Alexa and take a tour around what remains of the Branch Davidian compound. Now I understand that this is on the site of the original chapel, is that right?
Yes,
That's
it
right.
was. And the front door is in where the front door was on the original as well.
Okay. And I've noticed you've got memorials along the road here. What are these memorials?
Yes. Well, this here is a 12-stone altar. They're natural stones that I put together. And I did that to dedicate the property back to the Lord after the fire and the conflagration that took place here. And this is a monument for those that died here.
And people come and leave coins?
Right, they do. Stones and coins on all the markers, yeah, especially around the front there.
To our right here, there are 2 memorial stones. One is for the people that were victimized at the Oklahoma City bombing on the 2nd anniversary on April the 19th of 1995. And the one in the foreground here is for the BATF officers that were killed in the line of duty here. And we were told by their own PR person on the local news that evening that they were shot by friendly fire, which means their own people shot them. But the next morning it was blamed on the Branch Davidians. And the building stretched from this corner of this building all the way over to that Keep Out sign.
Oh, wow. It's pretty large.
Yes, it was. And over at that Keep Out sign, there's a bus that's buried that was part of a tunnel that went into another hurricane shelter. That bus was blown up on the morning of the 19th so that the people couldn't get out when they gassed the building. They couldn't go into the other shelter. Now we're going up to the pool here that David Koresh and his people built for their recreation, and I use it as a reservoir now.
So they built this themselves?
They built it themselves, yeah.
And in case you didn't notice, as we were touring around, we picked up an extra crew member.
I was coming home one night, and it was dark, and I saw 3 pups on the side of the road, and this guy here came right up to me, up to the car. I opened the door and he jumped in.
All right.
That week my son had prayed for a black lab. He wanted a black lab, so I brought him home.
Yeah, you got one.
I got one, that's right. He's been with us ever since. He's been here about 12 years now.
What's his name?
Buck.
Buck.
Buckaroo.
Awesome. Well, where are we heading next?
Well, I'm going to hand you off to my wife right now because there's, you know, the terrain here, there's potholes and that, and I don't want to get stuck with the wheelchair.
Sounds good. Well,
So I'm gonna
we're gonna be in her capable hands then.
Amen.
This was part of the tunnel.
So this is, people would actually underground go through here. That's the bus, or what's left of the bus, and led back to this open area here, which was what?
That was the storm shelter.
We're near Waco, Texas, learning the history of the Branch Davidian compound and hearing first-hand accounts of the rise of leader David Koresh from Branch Davidian Charles Pace. We've also been touring what remains of the compound made so famous by the raid there in 1993. More of that tour in just a moment. But first, Charles tells us what went through his mind when he saw the raid, standoff, and devastating fire unfold on TV.
Well, my first thought is, oh God, you are going to really do what you said you were going to do. And I broke down and wept because I knew that these people were going to be slaughtered. And that was the first day of the raid that I saw that. I went and preached that morning at the Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Gadsden, Alabama, where I lived. I was asked to come and preach. And I preached the same sermon that I gave in 1984 when I described what David Koresh was doing, and that the omega of apostasy is what I called it. And that's what Ellen White called it as well, because the alpha of apostasy was Lucifer rebelling in heaven. But the omega of apostasy is a man in the earth rebelling against God and claiming to be God. And so I taught, you know, I gave that study, and I come home, and my friend who was in the room at the time when I did the study, he called me and said, turn on CNN. This was about 12:30 on a Sunday morning, and I turned it on and I saw them being raided. Couldn't believe it. I mean, it just sent shivers down my spine.
Alexa, what are these foundations that we're walking through now?
These were original small houses that were all along the road before David Koresh built that large complex here.
Oh, okay.
And they were dilapidated and falling apart, so they tore them down and then built the huge.
And these predate him. Now we're coming up on this yellow metal structure here, which I'm guessing was the school bus.
That's right. That's the school bus that was crushed by the tanks on April 19th. And we connected the building, the huge complex, to the storm shelter over here. There was a little tunnel here.
This concrete here that seems to be collapsed.
This was part of the tunnel that connected the large complex to the storm shelter that's behind you there.
So this is, people would actually underground go through here, and what is that's the bus, or what's left of the bus. This is interesting because in here you can still see the tunnel structure somewhat.
Collapsed over the years, yeah.
And led back to this open area here, which was what?
That was the storm shelter. The government called it the bunker, but it was actually a storm shelter for the 100 and something people that were living here in Texas. Weather, and you know, we can have really severe storms out here, wind, and...
That's a pretty significant size storm shelter there, though.
It is, And it's collapsed over the years too. The top was a black tarp over it when we first saw it, and the weather has filled it with water and collapsed the top of it. Okay, we're walking up here towards where the water tower was and the original well. It was back here. It was like acting as a reservoir for the water that they pumped out of the well into the water tower. And you just stepped in fire ants, be careful. That was the original, right behind you. Oh. That was the original well, but I think they were working on it at the time. Yeah. And after the whole disaster happened, the government just came in and cut the cable and destroyed the well. So
oh no.
We've had to haul water in until they finally gave us permission to have the local water here.
And then this is where the water tower stood. Right. And nothing left of that at all.
Well, after that they cut it in pieces and took it off, I guess, as junk, and because it was showing that there was actually bullet holes in there, because that was the first gentleman, Peter Gent, that was shot and killed by helicopter fire on the day of the siege on February 28th. Wow. So it had evidence that they wanted to cover up. This is the original dairy barn that's been here since the 50s.
I call this the wall of shame because I'm ashamed that these people were killed by the government.
If you're not following Expedition Texas on Facebook, you're missing half the fun. We'll take you behind the scenes with photos and live videos from the road. See what we're up to while we're out digging up great stories to tell on TV. Then watch for opportunities to share your story ideas, or just drop us a line and let us know how you're doing. Follow Expedition Texas on Facebook at Expedition Texas.
Well, when David Koresh came, he changed our Judeo-Christian beliefs. And I said, you understand the punishment or the judgment that's going to befall you. It's the slaughter of men, women, and children, and a fire that destroys your whole complex. And he said, yes, I know that that's the prophecy and the outcome. He put his arm around me, turned around to all the elders and everybody else in the room, and he said, this brother's teaching truth, and he sat down, and that was it. But he agreed with me that he was the one that God called, and he was very adamant about, fulfilling that prophecy. And what you had in 1993 was the fulfillment of that prophecy. I call this the wall of shame because I'm ashamed that these people were killed by the government. But it has their names of each and every Branch Davidian victim that died during the 51-day siege, especially on the 19th of April, 1993. Now this memorial plaque here is the names of all the people that died, and it was donated by the Michigan militia. They brought it here the 2nd anniversary and dedicated it to the people here.
Now I understand that these, the plaques with the individual names weren't always here. Where were they?
No, they were under the trees. The trees were planted on a hill in a grove. And the Bible tells you not to have a grove of trees, especially to honor the dead. So I had to rearrange this whole thing. And I took and replanted the trees along the road, and I took all their nameplates and I built this wall. It's a 2-winged wall. But this way the people get the impact of all the people that died at the same time. Before, they used to have to go and look in the grass and try to find them, and it was hard to manicure the grounds because we'd be running into the stones and breaking them and breaking branches of trees and so on and so forth. So,
And are these the trees?
yes. This arrangement now, it's much easier to take care of, but it's more impressive to see all the trees along the road and this wall of names of the victims here. Now these stones on the top, the black stones, are the 7 shepherds of the Advent movement. And you saw their pictures inside, but we have Ellen G. White, Alonzo Jones, and Elliot Wagner, Victor Houdiff, Benjamin Roden, Lois Roden, and Vernon Howell. You saw their pictures inside around the walls, but here we have them memorialized out here as well with the victims.
Vernon Howell being David Koresh.
Vernon Howell being David Koresh, yes, correct. And I believe he was used of God to do what he was asked to do, and he did it, just like all the other prophets here.
Okay, this is the original dairy barn that's been here since the 50s and functioned as a home for the few cattle and many goats that they had here under the Rodens when they were leaders and owners of the property. It was also where the sniper team, the hostage rescue sniper team, was stationed during the siege. Okay. And inside when we came here, we found sandbags inside and a lot of shells and debris that was in here. And my husband and a friend fixed it up, and we used it as a chapel here for years before there was that huge structure up at the front there.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, this would be one of the only remaining structures.
Original structures on the property. Yes, that's
wow.
right. Mm-hmm.
And now what is it used for?
Now it's basically a shop for doing whatever projects need to be done here.
But so it was a chapel at one time.
It was a chapel.
Your husband turned it into one.
Right.
How do you feel about this place now? I mean, how do you feel about this place now?
I think it's a very important piece of real estate that something very significant happened here and has for many years, actually. And it's a place that people need to come and remember.
And people do come to remember. While we were there, no fewer than a dozen people came by to visit the chapel and to walk the property in search of their own evidence, to draw their own conclusions about what happened on those 51 days in 1993, when Waco, Texas seemed like the center of the universe, and the world was watching as prophecy was allegedly fulfilled at Mount Carmel in Waco. Down the road, there's another lost legend waiting to be discovered, and on Expedition Texas, we're going to find it.